So it's a pleasure to be here. I enjoy my time whenever I come over here from the other side of campus. It's always fun to be over here and to engage with students over here. I have my one PhD student right now. He's actually here in Harris, which is nice. And just to tell you what it's like to be a PhD student of mine, she's actually in Switzerland doing her work there. So there's certain benefits in working with me. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about the connection between, possible connection between nuclear power and climate, and doing something about the climate. The work that I've personally done on this relates to aspects of this, not all parts of this, mostly on the technology side of nuclear power. One of the things that I've been personally interested in, I've worked on, is advanced reactor designs. I started a center at Argonne to use the sort of next generation of computers, exascale computers, to do reactor design. So I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in the question of how much it actually costs to build these things. So we'll talk about all of that. And I'm obviously, I get all of us here are interested in the climate issue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to draw you a picture about how you get from what we presently know about climate and what we presently know about nuclear power to actually trying to answer the question, is it useful to have nuclear power in the future? Is it something that we should be interested in? So I'll talk about first what the challenge is. The challenge is basically to decarbonize the electricity sector. That is the challenge. And just nominally, I'm going to pick a date of, pick the date of 2050. There's no real rational reason for doing it. You can talk about that, but that's a good date. A lot of people talk about 2050. And there are different ways of thinking about what you want to do by 2050, and I'll talk about that. Then the question of whether or not it actually even makes sense to talk about this subject relates to the question which has to be answered, which is it even possible, given everything working out just fine, to actually build new power reactors at a pace that can make a difference by 2050? How much is it going to cost? What other alternatives do we have? Then finally, there are a bunch of issues that bedevil nuclear power in particular. Now I'll talk about them. From safety, security, waste disposal, proliferation, and of course, public perception. So before we start, I think it's important to understand that even though nuclear power started in the United States, it actually started about 5 blocks away from here. In fact, next year will be the 75th anniversary of CP1. CP1 was the very first reactor ever built. It was the very first experiment that demonstrated that you could control the chain reaction, nuclear chain reaction. It happened on Ellis Avenue. There's a monument there by Henry Moore, which memorializes it or celebrates it. The divisions of opinion about which it is. When you look at the statue, the sculpture, there's some debate about what it represents. Is it a skull? Is it a mushroom cloud? What is it actually? And I think Henry Moore was actually smart enough to realize that is the point. There is a question mark here. Think of that sculpture as a question mark. So the United States started it, we started it, but today we're no longer in charge, for sure. And the question about what we have to say about nuclear power and to what extent other people pay attention to us is an important question, and my view is that the answer is they basically are uninterested in what we have to say. Some people are, but there are many people out there who are substantive, who are doing things, who basically don't really care what we have to say. And among these are two of the countries that are probably going to be building more nuclear plants than anybody else. And that's the Chinese and the Indians. So just keep that in mind. So I've been working on a side project with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, in a project called the Global Nuclear Future. It's all about this issue of what we can say to them. Those are folks out there. And one thing that we've learned as part of that effort is that when you go to talk to other people outside the United States about this issue, the last thing they need to hear is a lecture from Americans. Americans love to lecture. I confess, I love to lecture. I love to tell everybody what to do, including my kids. Okay, it's just in my nature, and I think in the nature of many people in this room. It's not always welcomed. In fact, it's often counterproductive. So it's something just to keep in mind. One very important issue is that when we think about nuclear power, especially in the context that I'll be talking about it here at noon, we think of it as something having to do with climate change. It's a technology that does not produce much carbon emission, does produce some, but not much, in order to address the climate change issue. Other folks don't see it that way. So, for example, the reactors that are currently being built in Abu Dhabi, in the Emirates, there are 4 reactors being built. The Koreans are building them. They're advanced, very, very advanced reactors, so-called Generation 3+ reactors. They're being built not because Abu Dhabi worries about climate change. They're being built because Abu Dhabi worries about water. And those plants are going to largely be used for desalination of seawater. That's what they're about. And they don't want to burn oil in order to do that. So they have a long-range vision. They know the oil is going to run out, but their need for water is not going to run out. So they want an energy source that will be there for the long term. And what I mean by long term is, even though you think uranium is a finite resource, it's finite on the timescale of millennia. Oil is on a finite resource on the timescale of decades. By 2100, we're going to have real issues with finding cheap oil. So they have different issues. They have different perspectives, and it's important to realize that among the people building are not only the existing nuclear states, but also the undeclared nuclear states. So, example is India. Of course, India never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, never signed a comprehensive test ban treaty. So it never broke out of any treaty, actually. But they're happily building. What they did do is they violated, I'll talk about this a little bit later on, the ethical principles behind the Atoms for Peace program. Because they diverted material from a Canadian experimental reactor, CANDU reactor, in order to gather the material for their first weapon. So there's a breakout issue. Important thing to also understand is that unlike the United States, most of the energy companies in the rest of the world, both the utilities as well as the builders, tend to be state corporations or corporations that are like what we would call here in the United States Fed Corps. So a Fed Corp that you might be familiar with is the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, or the Bonneville Power Authority. So these are corporations that are allowed to make a profit, but they're chartered by the United States. So their budget is off budget of the federal budget, but it really is an entity of the federal government. So if you go, for example, to France, Électricité de France, EDF, is the utility. There's only one utility in France. It's really a French governmental operation. I believe the governmental share in the company is somewhere around 80%. Areva, which is the French reactor power builder, is owned now, I think, almost 90% by the French government. So these are companies that look like, if you don't look too closely, they look like private enterprise, but they're actually not. The same thing is true in China. The same thing is true in India. In an interesting way, it's not true in Japan, but Japan is there's a way of describing Japan. Japan Incorporated, and to think that Japanese industry is decoupled from the government is not correct. Okay, so anyway, there are these other things to talk about the rest of the world, which unless you ask me questions, I will now pass by. But you just keep in mind that all the kinds of concerns that we have tend not to be concerns elsewhere, or they're concerns that are repressed elsewhere. That's the other thing that happens. Okay, so what is actually going on? So these are two tables that show you who's doing what, and it's kind of interesting. We don't have people were talking in the United States about a nuclear renaissance, and everybody's asking, so what happened to the renaissance here? Well, it is happening in other places. China has now 36 reactors operating, another 20 under construction. So by roughly 2021, they will have half as many reactors, a little bit more than half as many reactors as we have today. And they're on their way to passing, blowing right by us. India is now 22, building another 5. Japan, despite what you've heard about Japan getting out of the business, they're actually building 2 more. And many of these reactors are being reactivated. An interesting time talking to the folks in Tokyo, the new regulator. And the attitude there is, we're going to continue what we're doing. We're going to close the older technology reactors, principally the boiling water reactors. But the pressurized water reactors, they're going to all restart. South Korea has become a major player in the nuclear business. They're building 3 in South Korea, but they're building 4 in Abu Dhabi. They're the ones building it. It's a Fed Corp, so it's a company that has very heavy governmental involvement that's building it. It's called KEPCO. Taiwan, building 2. If you're interested, there are all sorts of interesting things about Taiwan that makes it actually surprising that they're building 2 more reactors. So we can talk about that. In the U.S., so we if I were giving this talk 2 years ago, this number would have been 104. So we've closed 5 for interesting reasons. It's not that they didn't work. It had to do with money. But we're building 4, and it's interesting also to ask where they're being built. They're not being built anywhere close to you. They're being built in Georgia and South Carolina for very good economic reasons. And here's the total. So this sum, it doesn't make this up. The balance between adding all this up and this number has to do with all the other reactors all over the place. So, there are places like, for example, Sweden, which, can we think of Sweden as a pretty rational country? And they are. They use absolutely no fossil fuel to generate electricity. They have 2 main sources, roughly equally split, hydro and nuclear. And this is how many are under construction, 60. So that's the situation today. So you can ask, so what, if I use this target date of 2050, so what do we have to replace? So there are a couple of ways of thinking about it. But basically, if you think about, so I have to tell you one very important thing before a technical detail, which is there's a distinction that you will need to make in your mind between generating capacity and the actual power produced. So what am I talking about here? Take, for example, a 1 megawatt windmill. That's the rated or plate capacity of the windmill. That is, if the windmill were operating under appropriate wind conditions, 100% of the time, it would be producing 1 megawatt on average. So how often does a windmill fulfill those conditions? Not all that often. You ask, so on average, what does the windmill actually produce? The answer is somewhere between 30 and 40% of that. So there's a vast difference between what the plate says, this can do X, and what it actually does. Nuclear power plants are distinguished among all other energy technologies as having a very high percentage of power produced compared to the rated capacity. That's called the, so there are different names for it, but and I'll talk about it in a moment, but that difference between what actually is produced and what the plate capacity is for nuclear power plants in the United States is over 90%. So what do we actually need to replace? So the total generating capacity in the world is almost 7,000 gigawatts. Coal is about a bit more than 40% of that. Coal is the worst of the offenders, putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's about 2,800 gigawatts that you have to replace. That's what. So we would like to close every single coal plant on this planet by 2050. Now remember, so the generating capacity is this difference between what a plant actually produces and its plate capacity. And for coal, it's about a bit more than 40%. So in terms of how much power it actually produces, it's a bit more than a gigawatt, 1.25 gigawatts. 1.2 terawatts, terawatts. So that's what you actually have to replace. So keep in mind, what that means is that if I replace, just an example, if I have a gigawatt nuclear plant, it's going to replace more than a 1 gigawatt coal plant because it produces more power. So basically what you need, so if you do go through the arithmetic, you need something of the order of 1.3 terawatts of nuclear power in order to replace all of the existing coal plants. And one other thing to keep in mind is that nuclear plants don't last forever. In the United States, the licensing period for a typical nuclear plant is 40 years. That's a standard operating license. The NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has a process by which the licenses can be extended. The operating license can be extended. And it has done so for the vast majority of nuclear plants. So the extension is 20 years. And the assumption is when the relicensing happens that certain things that have gone wrong with the plant, typically leaks and pipes and so on, that these are fixed. So typically, in order to get the relicense, a utility actually has to invest some money. And this is, by the way, one of the reasons that the 5 plants that I talked about earlier were closed down, because the relicensing project, they were relicensed. But in order for the utility to actually formally be able to operate those plants, they had to invest. And it didn't make sense to make the investment because, unfortunately for them, they could build, for example, a gas-fired combined cycle plant, much cheaper, and they have investors, otherwise known as shareholders, that will hold them responsible for what they do. So they said, nope, we're not going to do it. So in the United States, there is this problem of competition with natural gas. So you have to replace, at some point, you're going to have to replace these plants. It turns out by 2050, all of the existing nuclear power plants, except for the 4 that are being currently built, will have to be replaced. And the reason is that some technical folks have looked at another cycle of relicensing to 80 years, and it looks like that will be killed by the economics of it. And the reason is that the principal damage, once you get to 60 years, is what's called embrittlement of the pressure vessel. And that happens because the neutrons that are generated as part of the chain reaction actually change the structure of the steel and make it brittle. And that means that at 60 years, most of these reactors, if you want to continue operating them, will have to have the pressure vessel replaced. That is a big, big deal and will cost a lot of money. We're talking about amount of money that's in the $1 billion to $2 billion range. It's a huge amount of money. And so it's unlikely that any of these plants are going to be actually operate past their 60-year operating life. And that means, since most of these plants were built in the 60s, 70s, 80s, that means they're toast. So in the United States, we're going to have to replace all of them. By the way, we're also going to have to replace most of the ones that I talked about before. Most of these plants will also going to be gone. So in all, when everything's said and done, we're going to have to replace about 330 gigawatts nuclear. And the 330 is I'm now using the number that is actually generated by the existing plants. Okay? And I'm going to make another drastic assumption, and we can argue about that there is no growth in demand. There are folks that say there won't be any. I'm dubious about that, but one thing that you can say for sure is that predicting the future is a challenge. And I'm not in the business of doing that. So what I'm going to tell you about is just what I'm absolutely certain of, not what I'm going to speculate about. So another way of thinking about this problem, a very different way of thinking about it, is to ask, so how much difference can I make in terms of getting rid of carbon dioxide emission? And Rob Sokoloff at Princeton and one of his collaborators in 2004 came up with this idea of wedges. So what's a wedge? A wedge is doing something. It could be efficiency. It could be nuclear power plants, building one. It could be going to solar photovoltaics, or going to solar thermal, going to windmills, etc. And the aim of each wedge is to eliminate, in the original paper, was to eliminate 1 gigaton of carbon emitted into the atmosphere per year by 2054. So the idea is that here's the profile of, this is what's called the business as usual situation, which you notice that there are actually 2 triangles because they redefined the wedges. But the original wedge was this one, the green one, and the business as usual trajectory was over here. So if you don't do anything, what happens is that we keep emitting more and more stuff. And then each wedge is designed to decrease the amount of stuff that's emitted. So the idea is, if you have enough, at that time with this definition, 7 wedges would get you to no more increased emission. Okay, then you just hold. Excuse me. And then of course what you want is to go down. So a bit later in 2009, they revisited this. They came up with a slightly different definition, which I'm actually going to use, which is related to this yellow triangle. So each wedge there is, they now are not monitoring the amount of carbon, but they're monitoring the amount of CO2 that's put into the atmosphere. And the idea is each wedge here now is avoiding 4 gigatons of CO2 per year by 2050. Okay? So that's the target. And the question I'm going to ask is it conceivable, is it reasonable to think that nuclear is going to form one of those wedges? That's the question. What would you have to do in order to get there? Okay? And that relates, of course, to this question of how fast you can actually build. So there are 2 ways of approaching this. You can just make it up, or you can actually ask, so what did people do before? Especially before people got worried about nuclear power, in the heyday of nuclear power. The answer is that if you look at the period of 1970 to 80, that period was the most active period of building nuclear reactors. The period from 60 to 80 was where more than half of the existing reactors were actually put in service. And if you look at this period, 1970 to 1980, that pace was building 14 reactors per year worldwide. Now, if you maintain that, if you were to go back to that pace today, and you think about the kind of reactors that we would be building, which are these Gen 4 plus reactors, they're basically 3 main candidates, non-Russian candidates. There's a Russian competitor I'm not going to talk about, but if you ask me, I'll tell you about it. So this is the French reactor, the EPR. The AP1000 is a Westinghouse reactor. It's really a Japanese reactor, but never mind. And the APR 1400 is actually this reactor redone somewhat by the Koreans, and this is the one that KEPCO is currently selling is the one that's being built, for example, in Abu Dhabi. AP1000s is the model that's being built in South Carolina and Georgia. There are 4 of them. They're all AP1000s. And these have a plate capacity of somewhere between AP1000 of 1,000 gigawatts and megawatts. This should be an M. Sorry, 1 gigawatt. That's an M. That was wishful thinking on my part. I wish, but that's an M. And the APR 1000 is 1.4 gigawatts. Okay. So it's interesting that if you look worldwide, there's been an increase, a remarkable increase in the capacity factor. So remember, that's the difference between what is actually produced and what the plate says. This number, if you go back to the 60s, 70s, used to be more like 60%. In the United States, it was around 60%. And you might ask, what's the difference between 60% and going past 80 in the United States is now over 90%? What's the difference? And the answer is 2. There are 2 differences. One of them is that in order to get there, the utility has to exercise a huge amount of attention it has to lavish attention on the plants. It has to go in and very carefully survey, constant surveillance of all the moving bits and pieces in a plant, and then go in and fix things as soon as it's noticed that something is going wrong. That's one thing that has to be done. There's another thing. You might ask, why do they do that? Well, the difference between selling electricity when you're using 60% of your capacity, your capability, and 90% of capacity, that's a big number. You make a lot more money. And so the big insight for the utilities was that if we can only figure out how to operate these plants more efficiently, we actually might make more money. And that is exactly what happened. So that's where we are today. So it's interesting that if we build these plants under conditions, operating conditions that we find today, certainly in the United States and I think most other nuclear power countries, what you find is that the number of reactors that you have to build is actually quite a bit less than what you have to replace. That's an important point. So how expensive is it going to be? So in order to get into this discussion, what I decided to do is, as first blush, not to exercise any editorial discretion. And I'm just going to show you what you will find at the DOE Energy Information Agency website. So this is the place in the Department of Energy where all sorts of energy data can be found. It's a sort of a treasure trove of data. And I've simply taken these numbers from that website. I have altered the thing. Okay? So what you're seeing here is the different technologies on the left, the size in megawatts of the nominal installation, then what's called the overnight cost. So that is the cost per kilowatt, okay, per kilowatt in 2015 dollars, which means it does not include things like the interest charges. Okay? It just includes the amount of money that I had to spend in order to get the thing, to actually build the thing. Okay? And then finally is the capacity factor. So here are the numbers. And the first thing you notice is nuclear is right at the top, along with offshore wind. Some of them are amazingly cheap. Here's land for wind. This is the reason, right here is the reason why nuclear folks are saying, and you're subsidizing this, really? Now you might ask why it is that a utility like Commonwealth Edison here doesn't like wind. You might say, I mean, don't these numbers say that this is a really great idea? I'm curious whether anybody knows the answer to that, except some people down here who cannot answer this question. They're not allowed to. I'm not allowing them to answer it. I mean, right? I mean, if you're a rational person, you look at this and say, who in their right mind would build this? Who in their right mind would do this? you could also ask me, why did I put this one down here? This is fossil burning, right? Why would I include this in when I'm talking about green technologies? Boy, you guys shy. Unbelievable. Okay. So the answer is pretty simple. Nuclear has a large capacity factor. Wind, let's pick this one because it looks so cheap, has a capacity factor that's 1/3. What does it tell you? That if I wanted to produce as much power as a nuclear power plant using wind, I can't use the plate number. That's useless. I have to multiply that by 3. So this cost isn't $1,600. It's 3 times $1,600. And that doesn't account for the fact that this is intermittent. So if I have a system where the power that I'm producing is constantly fluctuating because the wind, you might have noticed, doesn't always blow the same way, then I have to have a backup. A utility is mandated by the Public Utility Commissions to provide assured supply. That is their charter. And so they need to back up. What's going to be the backup? Well, it's going to be something that you know you can turn on reasonably quickly, that's going to be used some fraction of the time. Well, in the United States, the peakers, they're largely, the cheapest peakers are these, advanced combined cycle plants. They don't yet have CCS, unfortunately. My guess is they'll never have CCS, but never mind. So again, now when you think about the overnight cost for a combined cycle plant, it's also fairly low, but you're using it maybe only 1/3 of the time. All of a sudden, this is no longer such a bargain. The electricity from these things is very expensive. So the end result is that if you really figure out how much it costs a utility to operate a system that has a lot of wind in it, it turns out this number here is actually not the relevant number. So you just keep that in mind. Okay. So let me just continue. So I've already told you about this second part. But there's another part which is very telling. So you might ask, where did this number come from? This one right here. So I happen to know because I've actually myself gone through the details of actually figuring out what that number is. Okay? And in the United States, this number has some elements that are related to the unfortunate experience of building power plants in the United States, nuclear power plants. Let me give you an example. Lilco used to be the utility in New York supplying electricity for Long Island. And they built a nuclear power plant. They got, in those days, the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, gave 2 licenses. One license was the construction license, and the second license was the operating license. They had gotten the construction license. And Lilco was, I would say, not exactly the most consumer-friendly corporation. And so there were protests. They ignored them. They built the power plant. It was finished. They were close to loading the core with nuclear fuel, and they were just waiting for the NRC to give them the operating license. What happened? NRC didn't give them the operating license. That power plant never operated. Lilco went bankrupt. So now think of the reaction of the big banks that lend money for these power plants. A typical power plant it costs somewhere around $6 to $7 billion. And I can assure you that companies like Exelon or Entergy or Constellation does not have $6 or $7 billion lying around. So they're going to go and they're going to borrow it. And the banks are going to say, what is it like? How likely is it that you're going to come to completion with this project and it's actually ever going to operate? Now today, things are a little bit better because the NRC today has a combined license. When you get your construction license, you also get your operating license. It's a single license. So that's good, okay? But there is a problem in cost containment. Are you sure that when you say it's going to cost between $6 and $7 billion, that it's really going to cost $6 or $7 billion? So let's look at that for a second. So here is KEPCO. So this is the Korean company. It's building, as I said, 4 AP1400s. The construction cost, there is a debate because let's just say that things have not been completely transparent. Somewhere between 25 and $30 billion. This is, I think, the real cost, and I think this is the cost because there was a subsidy by the Korean government. I think it was kind of a loss leader, in my opinion. But in any case, the amount of money is, even if you take the larger figure, is well below, it's $1,000 below the number that you see on the EIA website. Now you ask, why is this so? Well, I was there last January in Abu Dhabi, and I could see they're actually completing the plant. The plant, so I was in January, the plant is going to open and produce power just past the new year, in 2017. They started building in 2012, 5 years to completion. And the 3 other plants are going to go right after, 1 year after the other. So when you go there, you ask, so who's building this stuff? The Koreans. The place, there is actually a Korean town that was built next to the site in Abu Dhabi. The people building it are all Koreans. They have built other plants before. This is a highly experienced workforce. Let's take another example. Areva, the French company, they were going to build 2 EPRs, which is the European design, in Finland. And the plant cost was $3 billion per plant. So today, if you go to the Areva website or to the Finnish websites on the subject, the anticipated cost is now $8.5 billion. It's somewhat different. They started in 2005. They were supposed to finish 4 years later. It's still not finished. So it's likely that this will be more than 9 years late. The end result is that the Finns actually canceled the second reactor. There's only 1 reactor being built. Probably will be done. Areva has exactly the same problem in the plant that they're building in. There's one plant being built in France. It's exactly the same problem. It's also EPR, hugely delayed, also similar cost overrun. It's also going to cost somewhere around $8.5 billion. You know, at this point, you know, this is why you will find people saying it's hopeless to build nuclear power plants because they don't know what they're doing. So my claim is, if you ask a company that hasn't built a plant ever before, Areva is a creation of jiggling a whole bunch of French companies and one German company, Siemens, together. Its predecessor, one of its predecessors, Framatome, was actually responsible for the last plant being built in France, and that was completed in 2000, 16 years ago. So ask yourself, what are the odds that that company still has people that know how to build a nuclear plant? Yeah, you have a question.
So is it true that the plants, the companies in France are going bankrupt?
So to say that there's a lack of transparency in the financials of French companies doesn't begin to describe it, okay? But I think the following thing is true. That Areva itself, I believe, is going to go out of the reactor construction business. They have a money-making business line in the nuclear area. They actually make a lot of money in the United States. Areva USA makes a lot of money in fuel services. They supply fuel to, for example, the power plants here in Illinois. Okay, so that's an ongoing business. They're also busy in power plant repair and the servicing business. But it's very clear that they simply don't have the workforce to actually build these plants. I mean, they basically, each reactor that they have now being built is basically a training exercise in rebuilding the expertise on how to build the plant. So the way you should think about this number right here is that's the cost of relearning how to build a nuclear plant. It's not the cost of the plant. It's the teaching exercise for Areva to figure out how to build a plant. So I think they will be out of business. I just don't see it.
But it's not so far out of the estimate from the previous slide.
No, it's not.
I mean, assuming it
Yeah,
converts
yes.
to that 8.1.
But that's what I'm getting at, which is that the reason for this other number, this one, is because DOE took into account that the banks extract an interest premium on top of what they normally charge anybody who borrows from them. That risk premium has to do with the fact that they are not quite sure whether you're actually going to build what you say you're going to build on time and on budget.
Well, is the labor scarcity at all levels, or there's some?
So if this were a physics audience, okay, if I say stainless steel, everybody say, that's the problem. Okay, stainless steel is the material used for all piping. It's not copper. Okay? Welding stainless steel is an art. You cannot be, your ordinary plumber will have no clue how to weld stainless steel without causing leaks. Okay? And now you need thousands of people like that, not 3 or 4 plumbers. Okay? So there's a real issue in how do you actually get the workforce that actually knows what they're doing. The people building nuclear power plants are not the same kind of people that you built an apartment house with.
So it's not just that the high-level engineers?
No. So in fact, what Areva did is they did have design engineers. They brought French design engineers to Finland. So the alpha electrons were all French, and they knew what they were doing. The French at the upper level know exactly what they're doing. The problem is lower down, they thought, we'll just get a bunch of Finnish plumbers, and they'll help us build it. Or the same thing happened with concrete. Concrete pouring for a nuclear power plant is also technically very challenging. They thought, they built stuff. They'll build this. Well, no. So in fact, the first foundations that were built for that one plant that is under construction actually had to be torn down completely. It was mispoured. They had to start from scratch. So yeah, it's not. And, the one thing about nuclear that is you cannot deny, no matter how much of a proponent you are, is that technically it's challenging. This is building and using a power plant is like building and using an advanced airplane. It's not like a coal plant. Okay, so right. So basically, I told you that, there are issues when somebody tells you they know what the budget is and how much it's going to cost. Be very skeptical and pay a lot of attention to who is actually saying I can build it for X. So if it's somebody who's built lots of power plants before, you have some assurance that they know what they're talking about. If they haven't built one for a decade, you can be pretty sure they don't know what they're talking about. Okay, so what haven't we talked about? Safety and security. There's a difference between actual and perceived. The issue of waste management, non-proliferation, and public perception. Okay, so let's go through these quickly. So safety. Everybody knows about the big accidents: Fukushima Daiichi, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and these are very rare. These are the only accidents since the start of nuclear power for these kinds of power plants, but they were hugely impactful. By far, the most impactful one was Chernobyl. You might think it's Fukushima Daiichi. I think in terms of publicity, perhaps, in terms of real impact, Chernobyl beat it hands down. Why? Is Chernobyl, so this gets at what was the problem? The problem was construction design flaws, a failure of the regulator. In some cases, there wasn't even a regulator. And finally, operator failure. Each one of these accidents had each one of these components. In the case of Chernobyl, the technology used for moderating the reactor, that means slowing down the neutrons. In modern Western designs and modern Russian designs, the material that's used is water. The design of CP1, the one that we're going to celebrate next year, 75th anniversary, used graphite. The Russian reactors at Chernobyl used graphite. Why is graphite a bad idea? Well, when graphite gets hot, Guess what it's made out of? Do you think it might burn? It did burn. And the reason Chernobyl was so impactful was because when it burned, there had been a fissure in the pressure vessel. And so there was release of radioactive material, and the flame, the hot flame, then carried it up to very high altitudes. And of course, there are winds that then carried away. So the reason Chernobyl was so impactful is because it was a combination of using the wrong material for the moderator, something that burns, on top of flaws in the operating design and flaws in the operation. So my view is that some of these things can be fixed. In particular, if you look at the Gen 3 plus reactors, they don't have obvious flaws. It is also true, full disclosure, each one of these accidents had something else go wrong. So if you ask, what were the lessons learned from one to the other, the answer is minimal, unfortunately, because each one had a different technical failure. So to say that there's nothing possibly can go wrong with this, I'm not going to go there, okay? But certainly they're not subject to the kinds of problems that these accidents had. What is, however, important is that you need a regulator, somebody who comes and inspects constantly and has the power to enforce its decrees. That happened in the United States amazingly late in the game. It only happened after 3 Mile Island. Before 3 Mile Island, the regulator did not have the power to enforce its rulings. The NRC today can shut down a nuclear plant. At that time, that power didn't exist. You might think that the rest of the world might have paid attention to this, including the Japanese. Everybody always wonders, how could Fukushima Daiichi happen in an advanced technology society like Japan? The answer is they had a regulator that was empowered to deal with the misdealings of TEPCO. TEPCO was the utility that ran Fukushima Daiichi. They had huge technical problems. The regulator identified many of these problems, told them to fix it. They ignored it because they could. And the Japanese didn't change that until after Fukushima Daiichi. Amazing. So my view is that besides the technical issue, if you don't have an independent regulator, you are, in the long run, you will have a problem, for sure. And this is what in my view, is probably the principal worry that I have about the spread of nuclear power worldwide, is that in some places, regulators are empowered. A good example is actually the Emirates. They actually have just simply imported a bunch of retirees from the United States, and even some folks from the International Atomic Energy Agency, to constitute their NRC, which is independent. But 2 years ago, I was in Hanoi and met with the regulator in Hanoi, and it's very clear that in Vietnam, it's very unclear what you mean by a regulator being empowered to do much of anything, except to just opine. Okay? Because the power to regulate is not inherent in the position of the regulator, it's inherent in the power of the party. Right? It's a different story. Okay, what about security? So here is a power system. There's a generator. There's the step-up transformer, the transmission lines, the step-down, the substation transformer, and then the users, okay? And these are the poles that you see outside here. And every bit of this is vulnerable to interruption and has been, both to natural occurrence and to willful intrusion, and all that has happened. And these are just pictures of some of these things. Here's a nuclear power plant. Here's one of the transformers that sit here. You notice they're somewhat big, and here's some people. These are huge things. They weigh close to 100 tons, cost millions of dollars. Then you have the transmission towers, then you have the substations, also large transformers, and then us. Probably recognize this thing. Every single thing that I've pictured here has been attacked, willfully. The consequences differ hugely depending on what you attack. So for example, 2 years ago, there was an attack on a substation south of San Jose. That substation, you can tell there's a lot going on here, that substation powers all of the Bay Area. Everything from San Jose north into Berkeley and San Francisco. And what somebody did is, you notice these things up here? You can see it a bit better here. These are oil tanks. And what they do is they are used to cool the transformers. These things get very hot. And what they did is with high-powered rifles, and they knew enough to know exactly where the cameras were, so we have no images of them, they punctured the oil tanks, they leaked, and the transformers started to heat up. What saved that substation was that they had cut the optical cables that were the feeds for the cameras, and someone paid attention and noticed that the cameras went out and said, I wonder what's going on. So they came in time to basically rescue the transformers. Why is that a big deal? This transformer doesn't have any spares. To replace this thing takes about a year. Imagine the Bay Area being without power for a year. So these things can be hugely impactful. Now what about this? We're talking about the generating station. Is that a worry? Well, the thing about the generating station is this thing right here is designed to be proof against intrusion, including a 747 hitting it. That thing that you see here is a concrete shell that will, in fact, if a plane runs into it, the plane will just basically bounce off it, okay? So these are some massive structures. So if you ask, is it likely that somebody's going to go and attack this? I would doubt it. There were attacks on nuclear power plants, but they were not on the reactor itself. What they did is they attacked things that are attached to the reactor. So for example, if you're going to attack the reactor plant, what you might want to do is disable it. The way to disable it is a nuclear power plant has two bits. There's the reactor, the nuclear part, and next to it is the generator, which is not nuclear. It takes the steam that is generated by the nuclear plant and then uses it to turn the turbine to generate electricity. So in Belgium, 2 years ago, a little bit more 2 years ago, an insider caused a leak a leak in the oil system reservoir that cooled the turbine. And in that case, they didn't realize that it happened. The oil did leak out, the turbine crashed, and now you have to replace the turbine. This reactor was out for 6 months. So if the idea is to interrupt electricity production at a power plant, this is the vulnerable part. It's the what's called the balance of plant, not the reactor itself, but the things that are attached to the reactor. So this is if you want to stop electricity production. The other thing you might want to do is you want to get the radioactive materials. And it's kind of fun to, you can look at this actually on YouTube, what it takes to get at the core of a nuclear reactor. This is not the easiest thing in the world. It turns out much easier, if you want the nuclear material, is to go to the spent fuel. The spent fuel typically sits in a place that looks like, if you've been into a Costco warehouse, the building structure is a lot like that. Okay, it's not a concrete, heavy-duty concrete shell. It's basically just a steel frame building. Excuse me, and it's not difficult to get in. The only thing that prevents you from getting in is if there's a guard force in place. If there's an insider in principle could get it. If you remove the spent fuel, you're going to die. I can guarantee you that, because it's extremely radioactive. So this is not far-fetched, right? There are suicide bombers, right? So we know there are people around that would be willing to risk their life, actually assuredly risk their life, to get at the material. But much more likely, if you want to cause damage, is you don't take stuff out, you bring something in. You bring a bomb in, you attach it to the spent fuel pool, or where the fuel is just sitting there in water, and you blow it up, and then what you get is a very nice dirty bomb. If you were doing this, for example, here in Illinois, you'd go down to Braidwood, you'd attack the two spent fuel storage facilities down there, and if you look at the prevailing winds, those of you who are sailors know which way the wind blows. It comes from the southwest and blows in our direction. So from Braidwood, we would get contaminated. So that's a worry. don't panic, okay? But these things, you have to think about these things. And then there's, of course, waste. I love this picture. This is in the optimistic period. This is the entrance to Yucca Mountain. These are dry cask storage. You'll find these casks just north of here on the shores of Lake Michigan, where there's a decommissioned power plant. The stuff is obviously dangerous. It's going to be around for millennia. And the fact of the matter in the United States is that we've been at it for 60 plus years, and we still don't have a plan that's agreed upon and funded to actually do something about this stuff. This, in the Obama administration, this thing was shut down. I think speculation is rife with Harry Reid retiring and Trump in charge, whether this is going to be reactivated. I bet the answer is yes. But still, you should just know that the legal carrying capacity of Yucca Mountain is enough to take all the existing fuel, spent fuel, and put it in, but not enough to get any extra material. So any extra material that's being produced today would not fit into Yucca Mountain already. We should need a second repository. So this is an issue. It's an issue almost everywhere. It's amazing that this is a universal problem in the world, with the exception of two countries, Norway. Oh my God, this is a mistake. It's Sweden. Cross that out. Sweden and Finland. It's not true. Norway doesn't use any. Norway produces most of its power through hydro. And it's Sweden. I'm sorry about that. Sweden and Finland, and the key issue has been transparency, openness of process from the get-go. Remember that in the United States, the way Yucca Mountain was chosen is 49 states ganged up on one. And unfortunately, for the process, the junior senator from Nevada at the time was Harry Reid. Okay. Bad luck. Okay, so proliferation, I go through that. We don't think of ourselves, and nobody thinks of us as a proliferation threat, except we did proliferate in the 1950s. Now, we did give, we encouraged our friends in Canada, for example, to give a reactor to India, which was the reactor the Indians then used to actually build their weapons program. And but we do have some issues here in the United States, even today, because there is a process for doing enrichment based on use of lasers, which promises to be cheaper and much less detectable than using centrifuges. And just a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, the Department of Energy and the NRC said, okay, GE, you can go ahead and do this. Why they did this is a mystery to me, but they did. Anyway, but it is interesting that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has many critics, in fact, has been actually, I would say, reasonably successful. There's have been only one violation. That's North Korea. One conflict with Iran. Iran, it needs to be emphasized, never violated the Non-Proliferation Treaty. What they violated was something that the United States pressed for, which is a resolution of the Security Council that said that it should not do two things. One, it should not continue developing rocket technology for lofting nuclear weapons, and it should not go after reprocessing. They did violate that. But that was not part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty allows for members in good standing of the treaty to do things like enrichment. And the folks that you first think of, my God, what do they do? India, Israel, Pakistan, guess what? They were never signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this treaty, I would argue, has actually been pretty successful in the number of countries that used to have weapons programs that stepped back and stopped it. One of them is South Africa. And the key concern, of course, is the use of nuclear power as a stalking horse for building the infrastructure, human infrastructure, and the physical infrastructure for weapons, and what's called breakout, which is go ahead, you've used all this knowledge, and now you're going to build weapons. And in my mind, this is a key problem in the Middle East. It's likely that the Saudis are going to replicate exactly what the Iranians have done, and that is a concern. Okay, So public perception, I'm going to spend no time on this. We started, there was a Disneyland TV series. One of the episodes was Our Friend the Atom, Eisenhower's Atom for Peace initiative. All this is of a kind. In the 50s, people thought that nuclear power was going to save us all. Okay? It was going to be the answer to all of our energy problems. And of course, it didn't turn out that way. And the problem has been, I would argue, largely an issue, if you talk about public perception, an issue of inattention, lack of transparency, and just plain ignorance. So on the technical weakness, the idea that in a commercial reactor you'd actually use graphite as a moderator is amazing. We still, the amount of money that's been devoted to figuring out exactly what the story is with low dosages of radiation. Is there, in fact, a threshold, damage threshold or not, is still, to this day, not established scientifically. The NRC assumes that there's a zero threshold. But whether that's correct or not, we actually don't know. So there's still technical weaknesses, I would say, that we haven't invested. There's certainly a misunderstanding of the regulatory regime. The idea that you absolutely must have an independent regulator was, even in the United States, was not understood until fairly recently. Of course, the Atoms for Peace program ended up being a proliferation program, because India is the classic example. You can't get away from the fact that weapons and nuclear energy are coupled intimately. The energy program came out of the weapons program. And then, of course, with the three major accidents. All this added together, if you ask yourself, is it a surprise that people are worried about nuclear power? I would say no. But I think it's true, now here I got it right, that if you're open about what you're doing, if you're completely transparent about what you're doing, it goes a long way to actually getting people to be much more relaxed. When I was lab director, there was a lot of nuclear stuff at the lab. There's much less now, lucky us, but there was a lot of nuclear material, including plutonium on site. And you might rightly think that the folks, for example, Lamont, which is the town right outside, the lab is in Lamont, might worry about this. And the lab has a long tradition of being completely transparent about what it does. Every month, people from the local area come to the lab, and they're shown everything. There's nothing that is hidden from view. And so that is crucial for people understanding of what things are about, what the threats are. So, the Finns and the Swedes understood this, and they now have, actually, they're building long-term repository. They're the only place where that's been a success. And Canada had a similar problem to us. They basically got stuck, and they did a reboot of their nuclear waste program. There was a royal commission chaired by a woman who was just fabulous. I can't say enough good things about her, who just got the point that you have to be completely open and transparent. So I'm going to take the optimistic route. Let's assume that everything is good. We're going to assume that safety, security, waste disposal, proliferation issues, we can resolve them, and that we figured out how to get the public on board. That's the best you could do, right? So now, could you answer the question I started out with, which is, what's the story? So it turns out, if you use the numbers I had before, you'd be building at 20 gigawatts per year. That means that you could replace all of the existing coal plants in the world and all of the existing power plants by 2100. Remember what I said was the goal, 2050? So this is saying, no, you cannot do it. Given this, you cannot do it by 2050. It's not possible. And if you want to eliminate the coal by 2050, you'd have to double the build rate to 40 gigawatts per year. Whether that can be done is an open question. And part of the reason is that the current limit on the production of nuclear power plants is making the pressure vessel. It's a very, very large forging. And there are not many places that can do that. I think they're probably telling me I should stop. I'm getting close. Okay, so this tells you that this is challenging, okay? You'd have to really change things. So if you want to get one of the Rob Sokolov's wedges at this build rate, you can do it in 80 years. Again, we miss. Okay? If you want to get to 2050, you again have to more than double the build rate. So what it tells you is that in order to get one of the wedges will not be easy. It could be done, but it has to be done with a lot of attention and intention, because you have to change the way we do business today. And this is that statement, I think, applies to almost everything that we do in battling climate change. I could have told the same kind of story for wind, for solar, for any kind of technology that you think is going to replace fossil fuel plants. It's a challenge. And the only way you're going to get there is if people are convinced that it must be done. And you know, I have to say I'm a techno-optimist. I think the barrier here is not technology. I think it's political will. I think it's our intention. Do we want to do this? Do we understand the threat is big enough to make the investments? Because ultimately it is about the money. So that's what I want to leave you with. Here's the conclusion. You're going to end up with a mix of technologies, and for each technology that you use, whether it's efficiency, whether it's wind, whether it's solar, whether it's tidal, whether it's nuclear, you have to go in there with intention and do it. And right now, quite frankly, the intention is not there. You know, if you're wondering about that, just think of what happened in Paris. The fact that everyone came in and said, yes, we know there's a problem. So there were no deniers in Paris. And yet what was on the table as the offer, in terms of what each country was going to do, was well short of what's needed to be done in order to prevent a 2-degree average temperature increase, much less the 1.5 degree that was pushed. In other words, what people put on offer had absolutely nothing to do with what the same people said was the threat. And that tells you a lot about the state that we're in. We're basically not there yet. With that, I think ready for discussion.
For questions?
Yep.